Hi, I'm Matthew DeGeorge. I just wanted to provide a quick intro here before I posted this video, just because I wanted people to know I'm a real live person behind this video, and this is an experiment in me creating AI generated content. I'm not trying to pass this off as a real voice. I'm not trying to pass this off as anything particularly creative in terms of what I've produced here. It's more of an experiment in using the OpenAI text-to-speech API and the text-to-image APIs. And I'm using that with text that I'd previously personally written. So I haven't been a professional software developer for over 20 years. I wanted to get my hands a little dirty to see how combining AI and algorithms, that is software algorithms, might be able to help express creative content. So I think it's important to make the distinction between AI generated content that is purely AI generated versus AI generated content which is helping people express content that they've created and do that last very few difficult steps of making it ready to publish online. So even this little video introduction's taken me 3 attempts to do. These little content creation steps can take longer than you expect, whereas if you're a writer, you actually just want to get your words out into the world. I'm not a writer either, but that's okay. So on my other channel, Organizational Reasoning, I explore how we need to refine our organizational systems in order to take advantage of AI. My argument is that commodity AI capabilities are not differentiating precisely because they are available to everybody. So what will increase the value of AI? A type of constraint that focuses the AI's attention on something in particular. This is why organizations and institutions are so important to the future of AI, as the role of institutional structures has always been to constrain in this way. This is why we sometimes feel constrained within organizations, by the way, even when those constraints have a positive impact on the overall output of the organization. So this simple experiment is to break away from the chatbot interface of ChatGPT and use the API, that is the application programming interface for those who don't know, and combine AI with algorithms, and algorithms being that type of constraint at the moment. This is a long way of saying I wrote a small program that does a few simple things. It takes the text of the preface of a book I wrote many years ago called Manage Without Them. It then converts the text of that book into speech using the OpenAI API, which is very simple, just a few lines of code. I then ask the API to look at the text as a whole again and identify some key phrases that would make good prompts to generate images. I then use the prompts that the AI has generated and feed them back into the image generation API, and then save both the spoken word audio file and all of those images into a folder on my computer. The last step is actually manual, so I had to drag the images and the computer-generated audio into iMovie, and the whole process, including both running the program and dragging those files in and spacing them out a little bit, took about 20 minutes. So to be clear, what follows is not my voice. It's an impressively generated computer voice, nothing to do with my voice, not trying to model me at all. But these are my words. I wrote them, or at least a younger version of myself wrote them, so apologies for any of that too. I hope you enjoy.
Manage without them. Preface.
There is this thing called being so open-minded that your brains fall out. Richard Dawkins, biologist, author of The Blind Watchmaker.
As naive as I am today, I can at least assert that I've tried to live my life in a manner which progressively improves my intellectual maturity. I conceived of this book in a time of youth, bravado, and a good many bad decisions. Some of the initial ideas were ultimately questionable, read wrong, but necessary steps in my thinking and catalysts to valuable, if not always pleasant, experiences. I'm glad my natural caution, life's distractions, romantic adventures, and, let's face it, my tendency to procrastinate have delayed my writing and publishing these ideas until I can honestly declare that the management transformation I propose is consistent with all of my experience. This is the case even where no specific research or examples are cited in these pages. After all, I wrote it to convincing myself my ideas have merit, not to convince others. While I now feel I can stand by these ideas, I certainly don't consider them complete. What I'm presenting is enough of a framework for a new management model such that a commitment to the management transformation can be made. I intend to continue to develop the model as I continue to learn about organizations and my place in them. I also intend to continue to read the work of others and recommend anybody interested in the ideas presented in this book do the same. My recommended reading list is available on managewithoutthem.com. I have come to my conclusions through a process of experimentation in the field. I never planned to write for a living. I work in organizations trying to get real work done. It's from this experience that I've developed the manage without them model. However, from what I have read in academic literature on the use of markets in firms, it is also possible to deduce similar conclusions from theoretical grounds. Because it has taken me so long to complete this book, I believe the content now falls into two categories. Firstly, trends that are already occurring and can be observed by viewing our workplaces with a manage without them lens. It's watching these trends play out that has given me confidence in my original idea. Watching these trends through my own personal lens is also the closest thing I have to a science of management and organizational design. I guess it's all any of us have. We observe, we interpret, we share our thoughts. The second type of content is what I call the manage without them, MWT model. I suspect the MWT model is likely to be difficult to implement precisely because it stops focusing on the self-interest of managers and instead tries to focus on the health of the organization itself. I genuinely believe this effort will be worth it. It will make our organizations more dynamic, more unique, and more robust in a future filled with robotic automation. I urge organizations considering implementing the manage without them model to appoint a senior executive, perhaps even a dedicated institutional economist within your organization, a chief management officer perhaps, who understands the most technical elements of how markets work and create incentives. If the MWT model is to be implemented effectively, the COO needs a peer in the executive team committed to the transformation of management itself. Alignment to the organization's purpose needs to be thought of as capital, not as a skill set of a particular class of employees. Implementation of the MWT model should be accelerated by its success. However, I believe it has been said that just as the initial spark of an idea requires an open mind, its implementation requires a steadfast single-mindedness of purpose that can only be found in the closed-minded. I'm also wary that perhaps it should be difficult to implement or even think too deeply about bad ideas. What I have found when implementing components of the MWT model is that while the results are appreciated, the response to the abstract ideas themselves can be quite hostile. This way of managing won't be for everybody, but I genuinely believe it is inevitable, just as global markets were an inevitable result of our ability to travel and communicate over large distances. Daniel Yergin and Joseph Stanislaw's telling of the battle for the commanding heights of our global economy will also play out within our organizations. What I call the incredible shrinking management captures this force where so-called macro trends repeat as smaller-scale trends due to lowering transaction costs. I've always been interested in improving organizations. At the beginning of my career, while my means were meek, I had to make do with trying to make small improvements to small parts of organizations. As I started to understand the problem space more clearly, I found that the improvements I wanted to make required changes in the way managers and management teams behaved. I was in for a shock when I tried to implement small changes in the way managers behaved. The managers themselves seemed quite unreceptive. As I mentioned, I was naive. My vague feeling that there was something wrong with the way organizations were being managed grew stronger. But I didn't yet have the knowledge or experience to articulate what exactly was wrong. However, I was new to the workforce and thought that maybe while many of the things going on around me seemed intuitively ludicrous, there were perhaps very good reasons for them. I was wrong. They were ludicrous. And as much as I'll always stand by the power of logic and rational thinking, I believe there is something about the way human beings are wired, particularly those with experience and critical thinking skills, which allows them to feel in their gut when things aren't right. This feeling we all have that the organizations we work for are turning feral should not be ignored. In 1999, when I started researching this book and thinking critically about the organizations I was becoming part of, my bias was towards action. I took great pleasure, I still do in fact, in challenging and controlling the organizations I was a part of. I enjoyed the manipulation of the organizations. I enjoyed playing within their politics and sometimes even watching them break, as they were pushed to their limits. Today, I still like toying with organizations. I love opening them up and seeing what makes them tick. Unfortunately, for reasons this book explores, I've actually found much less diversity across different organizations than I would have expected. One colleague referred to this as same crap, different logo. This lack of diversity is regrettable, and I think slowly being recognized as a problem. We first, of course, had to start dealing with some very specific examples of our organization's diversity problems. I believe lack of diversity in all its forms is created by the management discipline itself and serves existing managers more than it does organizations. With all of the calls to focus on an organization's unique purpose, if the management discipline itself is responsible for organizational homogeny, then the management discipline has to change. Any discussion about the nature of competition and a future of hypercompetition must support this. So, in addition to improved efficiency within the individual organizations, with this book and my consulting career, I try to help bring diversity back into our organizations. I'd always found it a shame that our organizations appeared to be converging into a series of bland and indistinguishable cubiclescapes. Now, with the rush to implement the same bland styles of agility, design thinking, and customer orientation in our organizations, I'm equally unimpressed. But I'm optimistic that forces exist which make a significant shift in the way we manage organizations almost inevitable. In stutters and bursts, it really is already happening. This book views management itself as a technology. Like all technologies, it must be used in order for any value to be gained from it. Equally, we should be cautious of applying it indiscriminately to solve the wrong problems. Also, if the technology is available to everybody, which the technology of management already is, how do we manage that technology and determine who is using it most effectively? With this view of management as a technology, we get a different answer to who in the organization is actually doing the most managing. Hint, those managing upwards. But if management is a technology, then it is also prone to the same tendency towards obsolescence as any other technology. If management was a technology true to its purpose, then that technology should always be improving and the management profession should be difficult to keep up with. But the current technology of management is stale, changes too slowly, and is not fit for purpose. Instead, we are left with a massive proliferation of what needs to be managed, while little progress has been made on how we manage. We have change management, customer relationship management, risk management, issue management, etc. Some or all of these are great concepts. However, as the management profession specializes and expands on these concepts and builds and fills the gaps of what is to be managed, they are in effect building a technology which takes more effort to achieve the same thing. This sounds very much like the technology of management being replaced by something less effective. This actually sounds more like a power grab than a technology. It may be true that the world is becoming more complex, and such claims will be made to justify the proliferation of what needs to be managed. But Alfred Lord Whitehead's claim, the civilization advances by increasing the number of things that can be done without thinking about them, raises the bar in terms of how we should measure our progress. I propose that the management process itself, when applied to management, or to anything, tends to make it less effective over time, to make it more complex and certainly more painful to think about for any length of time. Who hasn't had to sit through management speak that communicates nothing at some point in their working life? I propose that it is inherent to the management process itself that further management interventions will be required to correct the long-run effects of previous interventions. This argument has already played out in economics, with my favorite economist Ludwig von Mises as my source of inspiration. Big management is the next big government. When, in 1999, I first thought of manage without them, registered the www.managewithoutthem.com domain name, and started trying to develop an understanding on how organizations really work, I thought I was a pioneer. When I actually tried to discuss alternative ways of viewing organizations with any of my bosses or colleagues, this only seemed to confirm that I was pushing boundaries. However, what surprised me was the abundance of research papers, market trends, news items, and anecdotes that seemed to suggest that the habit of managing without them was already occurring. It appeared that managing without them was gaining popularity on two fronts. In line with my original idea, people were managing without them because that's what experienced managers had learnt to be a kind of best practice. Others were realizing that many of the activities advocated as those important for managers to be spending their time on had become an in-joke. Managers, as you know, also have managers, the more enlightened of which were starting to see that the behaviors of their bosses, while infuriating and counterproductive, were disturbingly similar to the behaviors they themselves were inflicting on their subordinates. Their staff, in reciprocation, were making the same complaints that the managers had seen themselves make earlier in their career. At first, the managers congratulated themselves on their new maturity. The managers were initially pleased with themselves for no longer making such complaints to their managers. But slowly the reality crept in that this wasn't always because the complaints weren't valid. In fact, what the maturing manager had learned wasn't that the complaints were naive, but that they would be fruitless. The other front on which managing without them was gaining popularity was with the so-called managed. Again, this group tended to include almost everybody, as increasingly there wasn't a problem from factory floor to corporate board, which apparently couldn't be solved with more management. The managed were managing without them, not because they had undertaken comprehensive research on the pros and cons of intervention-based coordination versus market-based coordination. No, these people were managing without them because they had no choice. They realized the activities being performed by their managers had minimal positive impact on their ability to perform their job or collaborate with others. In extreme cases, these people didn't know what their managers were doing because their managers were increasingly physically absent. From the perspective of the managers themselves, pressures to manage upwards and outwards had eaten away at their time to the point where they were no longer around to manage their team. Luckily, tools to facilitate direct collaboration were just around the corner. Years passed, and I continued to look closely at the organizations I was a part of and noticed the behaviors of those people who were the most effective. I noticed some patterns emerging. I also noticed that those who were most effective were not always those who were most recognized or the most successful in their careers. In any case, in these pockets of effectiveness, I also saw the diversity and enthusiastic collaboration that was so often missing from those organizations. I started to wonder why these pockets of effectiveness and collaboration weren't growing. It always seemed that it was more common for one of these pockets of effectiveness to be snubbed out than it was for the group to expand and infect more of the organization with its competence and enthusiasm. I'd heard a lot of talk about so-called best practices, and yet, when I found what was obviously the best practices within an organization, nobody appeared to be trying to learn from them or to replicate them. I soon learned that a best practice tended to refer to something that was going on outside your organization, and learning from the best behaviors that were already occurring within your organization didn't appear to have a name at all. I wondered what was stopping these intriguing and inspiring behaviors from spreading. I wanted to understand not only what a good organization looked like, but also what the barriers were to good organizations. So I started looking even more closely at what we call management. Matthew DeGeorge, Sydney, Australia, 2005, 2011, and 2017.